Hello friends, welcome back to my YouTube channel. In this video, we are going to talk about Azure SQL Database Read Replicas. And Read Replicas are helpful to improve the performance. That's what we are going to discuss. Read Replica is one of the major improvements that cloud computing has brought in. You could set up your Read Replicas to offload your read-only queries like your reporting requirements, your dashboards or reporting requirements or anything. So rather than putting pressure on the main server, you could use the Read Replicas for the same. So what exactly is a Azure SQL Database Read Replica? So they are used to offload read-only queries to this server for performance improvement. So it means if I want to kind of read some data from the primary database, I don't have to actually put pressure on the main server. Rather, I can create a read replica where I could offload all the read-only queries primarily used for the reporting requirements. That's what I could do. And it's used for high availability in Azure SQL database setup. So when you set up your Azure SQL database in the serverless mode, so you could use read replicas for high availability pattern. And we can even use the read replicas for the failover usage. So if something happens to the primary database, so we could actually use that read replica to failover and swap the position so that the read replica becomes the primary one and the other one becomes the read replica. So that's how this stuff is done, and the replication of the data is automatically taken care by the Azure SQL database. We don't have to worry about that. Now, in order to kind of visually understand, so let's say there is an application in a typical setup of a primary database as well as read replicas. We'll have a web application or any application that can connect to a primary database. Let's say the primary SQL database is hosted in East US, and this would allow us to perform all the read and write operations onto that. So it means all the applications which need read and write applications, they'll be actually connecting onto the main primary database. Now, when you create a read replica, so read replicas are more likely the used for the reporting requirement. So let's say I have a Power BI applications for reporting or dashboards or anything. So I could use those reporting applications to connect onto a read replica, let's say, which is hosted in West US, and it is only meant for the read-only queries only. So you cannot actually do any kind of an operations like create, delete, or update on that. This is more likely a read-only query. So mind it, when you create a read replica, both are two separate servers. Of course, the database is a kind of a replication stuff that's automatically happening, but there would be a separate database connection string for the main database, which is in the read and write mode, and the read replica, which would only be in the read-only mode. So it's a separate connection string that we will be using it to connect onto a read replica and fire our queries or the application's requirements are there. So by this way, it helps us to improve the performance of the system, making sure the application is highly available, the database is highly available, doesn't get bogged down by different queries or the read-only queries or write or a pressurized stuff. So you are just setting up your read-only replicas to kind of offload your work. So that's what a read replica is. That's I wanted to kind of discuss with you and let you know what exactly a read replica is. And now exactly how this is done, let's try actually get our hands dirty within Azure portal. So in order to create a read replica, let's go into the Azure portal and let's see how we could access that. So once I'm logged in into my Azure portal, I can create a resource, let's say, and we'll create a resource, let's say, in Azure SQL DB. Now, Azure SQL DB is just like a small database which we want to create for demonstration purpose. Let me see if it is SQL. Okay, so let's find it out. Yes, we have this Azure SQL. So we'll create that, and it primarily would give us three options. One is the SQL database, SQL managed instance, and SQL virtual machines, but we are more interested into the SQL database, and that to a single database. So we'll create that. Now, when you create it, you by default have to select a subscription, then you have to select a resource group, and then the name of the database. So let's say I want to give this name as a test database, and the server is, I have created a SQL server, RKB SQL server, which is hosted in East US, so that's fine. And I don't want to use an elastic pool, it's a development machine, and let me configure the so that it's only for the basic purposes like demonstration, and I just make it for the locally redundant backup storage, though it's not a good practice, but for the demonstration we are good to go. So let's go in for the networking, and I want to add the current client IP address so that I can connect my database with this. And then I'll go on to the security. Okay, it all looks good, nothing special, tags or anything, and I'll say review and create. Now once it is created, this is actually going to create a database named test within a server, RKB SQL server that's hosted in East US. Now firstly, this would become our primary database, and we'll be using it for, let's say, as I demonstrated in the PPT also, that you could use it for a read and write queries onto there. So it means all the applications that need read and write capabilities, they'll be connecting onto this database. So if I go on to the resource, it's created now. So you would have, let's say, go on to test. So you have this RKB SQL server, that's the name of the database, which sorry, the SQL server, how you could connect onto that. And then you could also set up the replicas out over here so that you could use the replicas, which will demonstrate. Let's set up a replica for the same. In order to connect to this database programmatically, so you would have connection strings, which you could check it out. They are more likely ADO.NET based, JDBC based, ODBC, PHP or Go language, so you could use that. But I'm more interested into, let's firstly see how we could connect to this test database. So if I just copy this, the server name, and I'll use the Azure Data Studio to connect that and see whether we can connect it out and like kind of make some database or whatever, like some tables even, just in order to make sure things work. So let me create a new connection, and let me pass on a server name, which is this. So the SQL login, I have a username, which is RKB admin user. So this is the username of the SQL server that was created, not for the database. So SQL server is just like a logical unit created in the Azure, what you call as services, and then test is the database that we actually created. So I'll give my password, and then if I just click on this database, if it is all looks good, it will try to fetch around like the database available within that SQL server. So if you see, there is a master system database that's there, and there is a test database also there. So let's say if you just want to keep it default, you could keep it, but I'm just going to connect to the test database, and let's say connect. So once the connection is done, it looks fine, everything would be okay, and you could start querying your database with some tables or anything if it is there. It may take a little bit of like it would be a little bit slow because we have used the very basic version of SQL Server, which is there just for the development purposes. So that's why. So now we can see it's connected onto here. I'll just click right mouse button and say new query. So if I say select star from, let's say, there's nothing, in fact there's no tables or in that particular database because we have just created that. So let's say it refreshes, so we'll just check it out and see if there is something there or not. Okay, so you see there's tables, and primarily there won't be any tables out here, so that's what it is. it would just be an empty. And of course you could create your own tables or add data or whatever you want to do within the same. So that's what it is there. It's just taking a little while, so we'll say within the tables. Doesn't look like if there is any kind of a table out there. Okay, let's failed. Okay, let's just try to refresh it. Okay, so we'll just do this. Tables failed to retrieve the data. Okay, so so that looks fine. We are of course in the test database, but what I'll do is I'll just create a small table. Let's say table employee and I'll say ID, which is of type integer, and let's say employee name, which is n variable character, and varchar, which is 200, and I'll just try to kind of run this query and see. Oops, I need to kind of fully run this. So when I do this, okay, the command gets successfully created. And if I just refresh that, okay, let me refresh the server again. So if I refresh the server again, click on the tables, never mind, I can just see select star from EMP. So if you do that, if I run it, I'm still connected to the test database. And yes, of course, your select star from EMP does not give you anything, because that's where your actual table is without any data. So let me insert into something, and I'll say values. So it is 1, and let's say I give my name. That's fine. I'll insert it, run that. That looks fine. One record is inserted. If I run this, so select star from EMP, and yes, so one record is there. Okay, so now we are able to create a database within the SQL Server. This is our primary read and write, because we are able to read the data, we are able to create some data. So this is our read and write operation. Now let's see how we could actually create a replica out of this. So now let's create a replica for our database. So if you could see, we have a SQL Server and there is a test database that we created. We even connected into that. Now let's go on to the replicas and let's see if we have a replica. So there is no replicas found, but let's create a replica. So we can create a replica. Once you click on create a replica, it automatically selects few details for you. So the main important is, if you see the primary database details, additional settings would be set up. So the primary database is test, and the region is in East US, because our SQL Server, the logical server, is hosted in East US. Now it says the database details required for this database, including a logical server and configuring the compute and everything. So I'm just gonna pick up another one, let's say, which is okay, so we'll create a new one, let's say. So we'll name it as RKV SQL Server, and we'll say Read Replica, RR. Okay, and we'll try to create it in, let's say, West US too. Okay, so this is something different. We are going to create it. So the name is different. You cannot have the same name. So it's created in a different location, and we'll use the SQL Server authentication. So I'm just gonna use the admin user, the similar one, and I'll just try to give some password. So that will make sense. So password matches. Okay, when I confirm that, okay, so there is a server that would be created, and it's the basic one which I need. I'll just go on to the networking, allow services to access this server, yes, and I'll just want to review and create. So create that. So this is how a read replica of the same server, of the same database, would be created. Now the database name is test. It would still be a test for the replica, but the SQL Server logical server is different. It is hosted in a different location, that is West US 2, and that's where it is going to be populating it. But the name of the database would automatically be same. And then whatever we are going to work within the primary server, it is automatically going to be replicating within your test, but in a separate read-only server. So it will take a couple of minutes to deploy, and once I just want to kind of don't want to go through that. So once it is deployed, I'll come back and we'll start from there. So friends, the deployment of the Read Replica has been done. It took a little bit of a while, so that's complete now. And in order to verify that, so let's go on to our primary database and the primary SQL server. This is in the East US, as we already kind of know about it. So if I go on to the databases, so I have a test database, which is primarily a read and write test database. We also connected to that. And now if I see on the replicas, so there would be two things. You'll see it in the replicas. The primary is the test database, and it is in the SQL server, East US. And then there is a geo replica, which is in the test database, and that's is in the RKB SQL server RR, because that's the name we gave it, which is Read Replica, and it is available in the West US too. Now this particular server is having a different entity, and in order to connect to that, let's go on to this server and we need to actually go back to the databases, and then click on this, and then set the server firewall, because this is by default disabled for the public access. So I'm gonna add my client private IP address, which is my public IP address. So save that. Okay, so now it is there, and I can use this because that's the database which is there. So it is primarily RKV SQL Server -RR. Rest remains the same, the database.windows.net. So I'll copy this, and I'll try to connect on to a new server again. So let's copy that, paste it over here. So I'll give the same user which I created, which is the admin user, and then I'll supply my password over here. And if I click onto this, it should be able to see the test database is there, and I can connect on to this. Now this is the read-only database which we have connected. So if I say new query, and if I say select star from employee, and then run this, so if you see, it would automatically be giving us the records result, because that should have been automatically synced to this database. Okay, it's taking a while, so let's see why it is. Let me just run it one more time. No, it's still running, and okay, let me close this, cancel that. Okay, and now I'll try it running again. Okay, so now you could see it is there. It's the same database with the same record. And if I go back onto this place, which is my old connection, like the read and write, now if I insert another one, let's say I'll insert it into EMP. This is 2, and this is, let's say, a test record, and I'll save that. I'll insert it, run this. Okay, this is done. And if I go back to the read-only database which I'm connected, I'll select that, run it, I'll get the database. That's a synchronization of the database is happening. But if I specify running the same command in the read-only mode, which is the read-only database, and I'll try to run that. So this would give me, if I run this would give me an error, failed to update the database test, because the database is read-only, because that's the read-only mode which we have set. Now there is another command which I could actually see whether my database is in the read-only mode or in the read-write mode. So I can just use select database, let's say database property ex, and then I'll say db underscore name, and then I'll say updatability. So if I run this, I'll run this. So it specifies a read-only mode over here. But if I just copy this and run it in the primary server, which we are connecting, which is a read-only, which is a read and write both. So if I run this, and just check this out command over here. So this tells me it's in read write mode. So this is in read write mode, and this is only in the read only mode. So that's how a read replica is actually available. The data is automatically synchronized from the primary to the read only. Now that's how guys, I wanted to kind of show this how you in the Azure you could actually use the read replicas. This is one of the wonderful features given by the cloud computing patrons, whether it is AWS, Azure. This feature is available. You could create number of read replicas, and it automatically helps you to kind of take the load out of your main server, and wherever the people or the stakeholders who want just reports or dashboards or queries, read replicas are the best choice going forward. So I'll be back with some more videos, so please stay tuned and have a good one.